Hi, welcome to the Innovator, where we talk about accountable innovation in higher education. I'm your host, Wesley Smith, and today we're going to visit with Greg Fowler, who's the president of the University of Maryland Global Campus. Greg also serves on the executive committee at the President's Forum. Let's get right to it. Thanks for joining us today, President Fowler. I can see you're in your Maryland office. I know this because I've visited with you there before, and you have some incredible art. So tell us about the art behind you.
So the art piece behind me is Preston Sampson. It's an art piece called Generation, and it's one of my favorite pieces. I came across it. We have such a large art collection that I go around the state, and we have pieces in all kinds of government offices. This one, I happened to just be walking the floor one day and came across it and said, I want that in my office. They replaced a different piece. But the joy of our collection is that it's so large, in fact, that I have yet, after 3 years, to have even gone through probably even half of it. But this piece is one that I really loved when I saw it, in part because it reminds me just so much of, the promise of higher education, which is the next generation will hopefully make it a little bit better than the generation that was before. So love having it here and reminding me on a day-to-day basis that this is what it's all about.
Yeah, what a perfect piece.
Yep,
Hey,
yep.
I know you travel. Your job gets you out and about probably more than any other president. You're around the globe. Tell us where you've been over the past, I don't know, month or two.
Sure. So I literally got back from a number of events in Italy, which is we have about 7 major locations around Italy, some Air Force, some naval education centers. And while I was over there, one of the things I got a chance to do, certainly I was in Naples, Venice, Vicenza, and Aviano, which is a large Air Force base. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know about UMGC is that we have a lot of field studies. Literally, in all of these places, we have faculty who are teaching hybrid classes, and a number of them are experts in their area. So when I was in Italy, one of the field studies that we have is the one that goes to Pompeii. And another does the off-road sides of Venice. So the faculty who were in both of those areas gave me sort of tours of what the students who were going through those areas were doing. So it's just that was one of the really good experiences. And then because homecoming happened, we don't just do homecoming here; we do it all over the globe. I was able to also spend some time at both the homecoming we had here in Adelphi, but also the one that we had in Germany as well. So got a chance to spend some time over there, just outside of Heidelberg, which is of course where we started our overseas work about 75 years ago.
Oh, that's great. So recently it's been you've been traveling east, but there are a lot of times where you'll travel way west. I mean, I guess it gets to the east again, but tell us when you go over the Pacific, where are you generally when you're out in that direction?
Oh, so in fact, I'll be over there probably in the next 2 months or so. Super Typhoon Mawar, which went through last March or April, really devastated Guam, which is one of our larger locations out in the Pacific. Some of our staff members' houses were flooded. They were without power and running water for months. In fact, they just got their internet services back up to truly operational in August, several months later. So I'm going to go visit our offices there for a little bit of time. But our big locations in Asia are around Tokyo, Okinawa, South Korea. All of these are huge locations for us that I'll get to, if not before the spring, then certainly during graduation. And I think I may have mentioned to you that we recently opened new offices and education centers in Poland, which is where the U.S. has started to expand as it gets closer to some of the issues that are in the Ukraine, and also in Romania and in Saudi Arabia. So at some point, we'll try to get some of those locations as well. So there are about 180 locations around the globe now that have some version of UMGC on the ground operating, as well as, of course, our online presence globally.
So, Greg, a lot of our listeners right now are probably thinking, what in the world? This institution serves all these different geographical areas. Will you just give a quick overview of how UMGC came to be and what the objectives are for your institution?
Certainly. So UMGC, as I said, we are now celebrating in Europe our 75th anniversary. In about 1947, just after the end of World War II, the U.S. realized that it had quite a number of service members who were going to possibly be coming back to the U.S., who were going to be basically non-traditional students, weren't necessarily going to be looking for a coming-of-age 18-year-old experience, clearly had some skill sets And very rapidly after that, as you may recall, the U.S. realized that, in fact, hundreds of thousands of service members were not, in fact, going to be coming home, but that we're going to establish bases throughout Europe at the time. And needed to figure out a way to do education in those places. And so they sent out a quick call to various places, to all of the universities around the country. And the only institution that said they'd be willing to try to figure out a way to do on-ground education overseas at the time was the University of Maryland. At the time, it was based out of College Park, so their School of Continuing and Professional Studies. But very rapidly, it became its own institution over a period of time. And that mission began to expand as well. So we started off in Europe with all types of faculty members on the ground in all kinds of circumstances. In 1956, we expanded, coming out of the situations with Korea and ultimately later on out of Vietnam. Into that space as well. And then, of course, in the early 2000s, we went into the Middle East. But a lot of people think of UMGC as this online institution, when in fact, as I said, we do all types of modalities, face-to-face, hybrid, live stream. And we have gone to every single continent, including Antarctica. In fact, I was just talking to some of our team members who were looking at some of our 1980s students who were coming out of Antarctica at the time. So we've been to every topography, have taught in every type of modality. Continue to try to think about new ways to help students be successful, which is one of the reasons why I think we're so connected with what the President's Forum is trying to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating history. Thanks for sharing that. Tell us now, you have a unique history as well. I mean, you've served in leadership positions at several of the President's Forum institutions at this point, and that includes your current role. But tell us a little bit about how you got to your current role.
Sure. When I started my CV a long time ago, I used to cut out some of the things that I did in college. But in hindsight, as I've begun to tell my story, it really does begin with my time in college was spent at Six Flags Over Georgia as my sort of job. I was at Morehouse in Atlanta. And so during the summer and during even some of the fall seasons, I learned a lot about how do you bring a team of various people together. So at Six Flags, it was rides and grounds and shows and all of the various pieces. And over time, that's really served me well because you're talking in higher education about academics and student affairs
Right.
and financial aid and all of these various groups. And how do you see the whole as opposed to seeing things in parts? But after college, I moved here to Washington, D.C., and took my first job as the National Endowment for the Humanities. My first job there was an outreach specialist. And that work was really in trying to help underrepresented populations get some of the federal funding and support to tell their stories, whether it was libraries or archives or scholarship. And it taught me a lot, gave me a chance to understand what was happening around the country in all 50 states and 4 American territories that would allow for us to think about those people whose voices were not a part of the sort of traditional experiences that had been part of NEH. And from there, I went on and became a professor at Penn State for a number of years, did a Fulbright to Berlin. Came back from there and decided, having seen what Europe was going through as with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unification, they were trying to figure out what does education mean for all these various countries. And so the Bologna Accords and other things gave me an opportunity to think about how do you really think about what value education has and how do you really get to answer that question as opposed to some of the traditional pieces. So I came back from there and got involved very rapidly with a small but growing institution called Western Governors University back in 2005. And at the time, it was relatively small, had not yet quite gotten off the ground in the way that it needed to. And so they took me on as a dean, ultimately as an associate provost, stayed there for about 6 years. And then actually for a year, took a job with Kaplan. Which is actually the Purdue global work that we are now talking about. Frank Dewey had a chance to spend a year and a half or so with Kaplan and then got invited to go to Southern New Hampshire University, where I spent the last 10 years helping them build up their organization before I took this job. So have had a lot of opportunities to see various iterations of higher education serving various populations around the globe.
Yeah, that's impressive. That's a lot of President's Forum institution knowledge in one career. That's amazing.
Yes.
Okay, so our listeners know that one of the biggest issues that we face in higher education is the idea of putting students first, this student first thinking, and that the President's Forum is really devoted to that. Can you give us an example of your current institution? How does UMGC put students first?
So I go back to sort of that background I just gave you as a starting point, and that conversation was really around. So we are going to be in various locations, jungles and beaches. And if you of course have seen my office, there are pictures here of students sitting on top of tanks. There are pictures here of students sitting on beaches being taught by professors. There are entire stories of us being one of the, in fact, the first institution to actually operate in active battle zones where we were trying to teach as well. So for a long period of time, it was geography and modality. How do we meet students literally where they were? And
Right.
now a lot of our work is really how do we do that in the virtual worlds as well? So when we're talking about putting students first, a lot of times when we talk about student centricity, it's everybody focusing in on the student. How does student affairs look at the student? How does financial aid look at the student? How does academics? What I'm trying to get us to do more of is see the world through the student's vantage point. How do I? It's when I go back to my days at Six Flags. When you're trying to build out an experience, what happens from the guest eyes as they're walking through the park? So from the moment we engage with them, what are they seeing? What are they asking? And this goes to certainly the learning experience, but it also goes to things like when they're going to struggle, what do the academic supports look like? When they
Yeah,
have
yeah.
questions about financial aid, how do we create an experience that allows for us, even in the communication in the letter? It's one of the things I have the team saying is, if we have to say no, how do we say no to them in such a way that says we are writing in a way that thinks about how you're going to read this, not simply trying to quote regulation to you. So really trying to impact the culture and a lot of the student centricity that goes into building a world that looks out through the vantage point of the students.
Yeah, I mean, this is the I'd like to think it's the front end of personalization of higher education, and how we work on that in the future. But is there any? Have you seen any particular success as you've been trying to address this from a student's perspective? Has your team made any change where you're like, yeah, why did we do it that way in the
Well, we
past?
certainly did that in some small ways up front, and that was even something as when I first got here and I was getting feedback. As you join, of course, you get from the students a lot of feedback on, can you change this? Or, hey, this thing happened. And some of it literally was as simple as the letter that we sent out to that student. Yes, the answer still remains no, but let's talk about the culture of how that letter came across. Certainly, when it came to the learning experiences that we put in place, we tried to design them far more so in that type of way as
Yeah.
we try to move forward. So these are sort of basic things that we think about, and they seem obvious until you really begin to dive into other institutions and realize that it's really hard sometimes for an institution, and certainly sometimes the members of the institution, to get their egos out of the way and say, I know that's how you want it. My mom used to say to me, treat people the way you want to be treated. As I've gotten older, I've begun to appreciate the idea that it's really treat people the way they want to be treated, not
Right.
necessarily how you want to be treated. So we're trying to apply that across all the various experiences that we're putting forth, again, from the communication to the design of the learning experiences, to the ways that we build out financial support and all the other pieces.
Yeah, yeah, great. Well, let me ask you about the President's Forum itself. We know that there's some issues that are so big that one institution can't deal with it alone. It requires several different innovative institutions, or in this case, up to 16 or 17 institutions that are working on it together. What can you tell us about that? What's an item or an issue that's so important that it takes a few more institutions than just one to address it?
So I think that there's certainly the big one that everybody's talking about right now is trying to deal with workforce development and skills-based work, and how do you create a common currency, a common language around that, or at least one that's acceptable. A lot of the work over the last couple of years, even within the President's Forum, has been, do we all have to absolutely agree on things like titling and labeling? And we've gotten to a very good place, I believe, around we need to have a common sort of agreement, a sort of broad perspective on some of these things around skills based and what the skills mean, because some people are going to say, is it a skill? Is it an ability? Is it a competency?
Right.
How do you define it and do those types of things? And I think what we have gotten to is a sort of a common space around, it doesn't have to be exactly this, but if we can agree on these broad parameters, that's going to be a big opportunity for us to work with the workforce and others to make sure that we're delivering on what we are talking about. I think that the other thing from a policy perspective that we are all trying to work on is trying to help make sure that policy and the culture really begins to identify and appreciate the non-traditional learner. because so much of what we have in place right now, whether you're talking regulation or legislation, whether you're talking practices from financial aid and other things, is all tied very much to that 18-year-old coming of age residential experience, and having the President's Forum and more than 1 million students being represented by the President's Forum allows us to be able to say there's a huge amount of learning opportunity out here if we're willing to do this. And as you know, more and more what we're seeing is that what we consider to be the traditional learner really is only a small segment of the larger learner audience that we are all trying to work on. So getting Congress, getting organizations, getting workforce to think less about the 18-year-old, not trying to get rid of them, but trying to say, in addition to all of those, the workforce is changing so rapidly that we need to be able to do these things in a different way. And we need to think about the rapid development of skills, the changing jobs for adults who may be trying to change jobs or trying to gain new skills, and how do we create an ecosystem that allows for them to have their voice and have their interests represented as well.
I love those two issues that you bring up that requires collaboration for multiple institutions, because I think they're so connected, right? It's if you're focusing on non-traditional learners, one of the first things that'll lead you to is a focus on skills and competency and the way that you can show success for knowledge that's already been acquired, skill that has been in the works for a decade or more. And so those two really drive you back to each other.
Yes, I was very happy when we had our President's Forum meeting here in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. One of the people who came in to talk to us was Chike Agu, who at the time was the innovation leader at the Department of Labor. And he was talking about, the jobs that we are seeing come online so rapidly that by the time, if you were trying to develop through normal governance or curriculum processes, which takes sometimes up to 2 to 3 years, those degrees, those skill sets, the environments that you'd be creating would be obsolete well before you actually prepared people for those jobs. One of them, for example, he talked about was a prompt engineer. A job that didn't even exist 4 years ago.
Right.
And will have rapidly changed even as machine learning and AI has changed in just the period of time that we've been talking about it. So how do you create that environment and having the forum be able to talk about, we want to make sure that the workforce has the skills that it needs, but those are going to rapidly evolve, and you've got to have practices in place that allow for that. Is an absolutely critical part of what higher education has to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, so we want to give listeners a quick insight into Greg Fowler. So we've got some lightning round questions that we want to hit with you, and then we'll wrap this up. Are you ready for 10 quick questions?
I'm ready.
Okay. What's the most important habit that learners should develop?
A sense of humility paired with curiosity. And what I mean by that is the more you know, the more you should realize how little you know, but you never should stop learning. So if you can do that, you'll appreciate what lifelong learning really means.
I love that. I love that answer. If you weren't limited by resources, what education passion project would you pursue?
So one of the big things I'm working on right now is trying to make sure we do this thing I call a Doppler radar, which is how do we see in real time all the various factors that are influencing whether or not students are going to be successful. If I had the funds to create that Doppler radar of the student experience in a way that we could forecast and move forward and see in real time things, that's what I'd be doing.
Ooh, it seems like that's kind of moving in any instance, especially with AI coming online and personalized education moving forward. We're going to get some version of that. Yeah. What profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
Well, it's funny. I go back to what I said a minute ago. My early days with Six Flags, I think I'd actually like to try to run an amusement park. I do enjoy going to them even now, but seeing the operations of them and how they continue to deal with so many different types of people in a customer service way is something I probably want to do.
That's a fascinating. Well, I can't wait to compile these questions. I think that'll be like the most interesting answer to that question that I've heard since we've started these. That's good.
Oh, absolutely. Hey, you always go back to what you started with, right?
That's right. I get it. What active president of another university do you admire and why?
So I actually would go with certainly Scott Pulsifer. He and I have some good conversations. I go back to WGU and the way they have continued to evolve and grow. I enjoy my conversations with them, but it's really important to be able to see how much WGU's really changed the landscape. His predecessor said at some point that competency-based education was going to become a bigger part of the larger conversation, and that is exactly what's happening. Scott's really
True.
taking that to the next level.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. What's the best book that you've read in the last year?
Oh God, I would say I probably the book that's probably most influenced me and that I've been most interested in was a book called "The Dead Are Arising" by Les and Tamara Payne. It was actually a sort of deep study of the life of Malcolm X, and it went back and interviewed everybody, including his current family members, to talk about how, because as many people know, the autobiography of Malcolm X is semi-autobiographical, but like a lot of those types of genres, there are stories in there that are told from Malcolm's perspective that probably paint him in a slightly better light than he needs to be. Just try to go back in and say, here's the real story behind so many different events. And as an English major, it's always interesting to me when you hear a various narrative that's different from what has become sort of the canon.
Yeah, I love biographies. I'll have to add that to my list.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of work, how are you spending your free time?
And when I would say I love to travel, but I do that so much for work that I have to go with. I love piano. I certainly get plenty of time in with the gym. And being a Southerner, I love barbecue. So the barbecue season is not yet quite ended. So I'm going to try to get a couple more of those in with the grill before it's all over with this year.
Well, I'm glad to know that that you're active on the piano. When our next reception might have to have a piano that's available.
Only if you do karaoke.
All right. What piece of advice would you give your younger self?
That's one I think a lot about, and I would say probably don't let people define you or spend too much time in your head, or set your agenda for you. I mean, as a young person, and I look back over my life, there have been plenty of times where everybody wants to give you advice or set the stage for you, and you spend too much time worrying about what other people think, and sometimes it's just go do what you need to do.
Great advice. What has been your best day at work?
I say this is going to always be true, and it's my best day at work is any day at graduation. I love graduation. Every time I get to see students who you see the tears in their eyes and you see the hundreds of them who didn't think they could do it, who are now doing it, it reminds me on a regular basis of the difference we can make in the world.
No, I love that. I mean, predictably, that is almost every university president's best day, which is awesome because that's
Yes.
what it's all about, right? It's about
Yes.
the ability to have a better life moving
That is
forward.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And to be able to impact people who didn't believe it was possible.
Right, right. Yeah, that's it's a fantastic day for those who haven't seen graduation, especially where you're serving mostly adult learners. I think that makes it a little bit different than a traditional higher ed commencement, right? When you've got all of these working learners and you have parents and you have children that are both attending and cheering on the graduate, it's a really cool thing.
Oh yeah, I go back to it is absolutely amazing to me to see an 85-year-old walk across the stage.
Yeah.
Or one of the things we have here is that we allow, if you want to bring somebody with you across the stage, you can. And seeing, fathers holding babies, or some people bringing their pets across the stage, it's been interesting. But hey, however you got through this, you did it, and that's what we want to celebrate.
Yeah, that's cool. What's one innovation outside of education that has most improved your life?
Free video calls around the globe. Because I've had an opportunity to meet so many different people. So apps on my smartphone like WhatsApp and others that have allowed me to stay in touch with my godson in Switzerland or friends that I've made in all of my travels. In the old days, it was very hard to keep in touch with people who you were connected to on a regular basis. But the fact that I can at any given time just pick up and, see somebody who's on the other side, and that's been particularly true with the work that we are trying to do now around the globe. But it's been, even on a personal side, I'm very happy that the technology allows me now, without spending a small fortune, to be able to talk to people anywhere around the globe for pretty much free.
It's an interesting development. I was reading the oral history of 9/11. That was one of my last audiobooks, and it was fascinating to hear that when the president was leaving the Florida classroom and he got redirected, they land Air Force One and they are trying to put together a video conference, and the technology that they had in 2001 made it exceedingly difficult to do that. It's crazy how we can do that at the touch of, our phone now on an
Oh,
app.
absolutely. It's like I talk to my godson. It's a couple of times a week. He lives outside of Geneva, Switzerland, and just being able to press the button and he can see me, I can see him. Even the conversation we're having right now is one because of that technology.
Right. It's amazing. It's amazing. Okay. We're going to finish with this question. If you could take a class from any expert, living or dead, what's the class and who's the instructor?
So, the obvious answer to this question is I would take a class from God and want to know the secret to everything. But that one's probably not quite
That's
there.
cheating.
Yeah. So, but the second part is Abraham Lincoln. And I would ask him to teach a class on leadership and innovation, because if you really study a lot of what he did during the Civil War, certainly we talk about the leadership side, but a lot of people don't realize the technology innovations that were going on, the railroad, the telegraph, and other things that really allowed the North to win the war. Beyond simply some of the other pieces. And so how did he use all those things to actually move the country forward? And how did he do so in such a way that said, we're not going to try to get ahead of our skis, but we're going to get this done?
That would be an incredible class. And I mean, just the ability to have any kind, there's so much wisdom that has to be in Abraham Lincoln's head that would be fascinating to hear him on so many different topics.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Joyce Kearns Goodwin,
Yeah.
when she wrote Team of Rivals, I read that a lot too, because in this work that we're trying to do, we try to bring the right people together. We laugh about it a lot and say, you want to hire rock stars and then teach them to sing in a choir, is what one of my friends once said. So how do you get the right people for all of the types of things we're trying to do? Because a lot of this work in innovation is you got to pair the traditional in certain ways with things that are new. So how do you take academics and student affairs and say, I want you to be thinking about tomorrow, and it's got to be different than today for people who came through a different type of system. So Team of Rivals has been another thing that I think a lot about when it comes to bringing people together who often may feel like they're at odds with each other.
Well, President, thank you for spending a few minutes with us today. We appreciate it. We will we'll be deploying this podcast on our YouTube channel. So those listeners who are interested in seeing the full video podcast, go to YouTube and check it out. And we'll also have it wherever you get your audio for podcasts. And we hope you join us again in the near future. Thanks.
Thanks for the opportunity.